Her second birth wasn't loud. It was a breath. A whisper carried by the wind that only she could hear, stirring something deep within her chest. Something ancient and patient. Before we begin, I want you to settle in. Listen carefully, because this isn't just a story. It's a journey into a world where beginnings aren't always obvious, where life sometimes grants a second chance in the quietest of moments. And as we explore this tale together, imagine yourself walking beside her, feeling each step, each heartbeat. Now, let's step into the world of Amara, the girl who was born twice. Amara was born on a night that seemed to hold its breath, as though the universe itself had paused in anticipation. The sky was heavy with stars, but they were not twinkling with the ordinary brilliance of distant suns. Instead, they shivered softly, flickering like fragile candles in a draft no one else could feel. In the small cottage at the edge of the village, Leora's hands shook as she clutched the coarse linen of the bed sheets, whispering prayers she didn't fully understand. Her voice was low, trembling, a melody of hope and fear that seemed to rise and fall with each labored breath she took. She had carried this child for months beneath her heart, a life pulsing with its own rhythm. And now, as the first cries threatened to break the stillness, she felt the weight of every hope, every dream, every fragile desire for this child's life to matter. The midwife moved around the room with quiet authority, murmuring incantations that smelled faintly of herbs and smoke. Her hands were warm, pressing against Amara's small, trembling body with a tenderness that seemed almost sacred. Each word she spoke was not meant for the ears of men, but for the fragile life she was helping usher into the world. She had delivered many children in her lifetime, but this birth there was something different about it. A subtle energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. When Amara finally emerged, her first cry was soft, almost swallowed by the night, but it carried a resonance that lingered in the air, a note that seemed to vibrate in the walls themselves. Leora bent over her daughter, pressing a kiss to her damp forehead, whispering, "You are mine. You are safe." Even as she spoke, her fingers traced a mark on Amara's left wrist. Faint as a dream, a crescent moon etched in soft pink, delicate and unreal, against the pale curve of her skin. The villagers would later talk of it in hushed tones, uncertain whether it was a blessing or an omen. No one knew what it meant, and Leora often lingered over it, tracing the delicate lines with trembling fingers, imagining that perhaps her daughter carried a destiny that reached far beyond the ordinary rhythms of village life. Those early days of Amara's life passed with the slow, sweet rhythm of ordinary childhood. She laughed at the flutter of birds outside the window, cried when hunger gnawed at her stomach, or when her mother left the room for just a moment, and stumbled across the small thresholds of her world, exploring with tentative curiosity. But even as she toddled along the familiar paths of home, she noticed things others did not. The wind, for example, was more than just air. It lingered, brushing against her cheeks with intention, shifting in patterns that felt almost like secret words meant only for her. And the river near the edge of the forest seemed to hum as she approached. A low, vibrating melody that resonated in her chest. A song that she could feel, but not yet understand. The villagers, of course, saw nothing extraordinary. To them, she was a child like any other. A girl with brown hair that curled softly at her ears and eyes that reflected the muted colors of the countryside. But Leora knew better. From the moment Amara had opened her eyes, there had been a spark, subtle but undeniable, a glimpse of awareness that went beyond the simple curiosity of a child. It was in the way she would pause mid-step, tilting her head as though listening to some faint echo invisible to everyone else, or the way she would reach out to touch the surface of the water and smile, as if the river had spoken to her, and she understood. As Amara grew, these moments multiplied, small and quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone but her mother. A leaf would fall near her feet, spinning in the air in an improbable dance, and Amara would laugh, clapping her tiny hands, her eyes reflecting an understanding of the world that seemed far older than her years. She would wander into the forest, drawn by sounds no one else could hear, her bare feet brushing against moss and roots with careful reverence. Sometimes, the shadows seemed to bow as she passed, and the birds would fall silent, as if listening, as if waiting. Leora, watching from the doorway, would feel a mixture of awe and fear. She could sense that her daughter existed not merely in the ordinary plane of the world, but brushed against something deeper, something older, something that the villagers would never understand. Amara herself could not yet name what she was feeling. Her understanding was instinctive, a whispering knowledge that passed through her chest and settled in her bones. She did not speak of it. How could a toddler articulate the sense that the wind had secrets, or that the river hummed a song she alone could hear? Instead, she carried it quietly within her, a tiny seed of awareness that seemed to pulse in time with the beating of her heart. The mark on her wrist became a focal point of this silent awakening. In the mornings, as the sun spilled gold through the curtains, she would stare at the crescent moon, tracing its faint line with a small finger, as if communicating with a friend she could not yet name. Leora often wondered aloud whether the mark had been made by some cosmic hand, whether it was a map or a warning, or simply a gift. Yet, every time she asked, the air would still, the birds outside would pause, and a quiet sense of expectation would settle over them, leaving the question unanswered, suspended like a promise. Even the village animals seemed to recognize her. The dog that followed her along the muddy paths wagged its tail differently when she approached, more attentive, almost deferential. Birds would linger near her shoulder, cocking their heads as if consulting her about the best way to proceed. And once, a fox emerged from the underbrush, locking eyes with Amara, its gaze heavy with an intelligence that sent a shiver down her mother's spine. The fox had vanished before anyone else noticed it, but the moment lingered in Amara's memory, seared into her awareness, as though it were a secret shared between them alone. Night brought its own revelations. Amara would wake from slumber, her eyes wide in the dark, listening to the quiet thrum of the village. The wind would slip through the cracks in the walls, curling around her small frame, and she would feel it brush against her skin with a strange familiarity, a sense that it had been waiting for her all her life. Leora would find her sometimes, crouched by the window, staring out at the starlit sky, and she would scoop her up in her arms, pressing her lips to Amara's hair. "It's all right, my little one," she would whisper. "The world is waiting, but so am I. It's not present." The child's first tears were not ordinary either. When she cried, it seemed as though the air around her thickened, as if even the atmosphere mourned with her. And when she laughed, the walls of the cottage would echo with a resonance that carried a peculiar warmth, filling the room with a gentle, golden light, though no flame burned nearby. Leora often wondered if her child was somehow attuned to the life that flowed unseen in the world, the rivers of magic and memory that ran beneath the surface of ordinary days. And yet, despite the whispers of wind and water, the extraordinary quiet of the nights, and the gentle hum of life that seemed to gravitate toward her, Amara's life was still, in many ways, remarkably ordinary. She fell off the low fence behind the cottage, scraped her knees on the rough earth, and cried for her mother to pick her up. She learned to tie her shoes, to recognize the faces of the villagers, to mimic the words and gestures of those around her. But the extraordinary lingered at the edges of these ordinary moments, teasing her with glimpses of something larger, something vital and alive, something that would not be ignored. By the time she was 3, Leora had begun to speak of the possibility that her daughter's life was destined for more than the small village could contain. She would tell her stories at night, about heroes and wanderers, about children who carried the light of worlds within them, about the quiet strength that comes from listening to the unseen. Amara listened with wide, solemn eyes, absorbing the words not just as stories, but as truths she somehow already knew. And sometimes, in the deep silence that followed, she would place her hand over the crescent moon on her wrist, feeling a pulse, a gentle thrum, a heartbeat that seemed to echo the very life of the world. Even as a child, Amara understood that she had been born to 2 worlds, the one everyone else could see, with its dirt paths and wooden cottages, and another hidden beneath the ordinary, a world that hummed with energy, alive with purpose. And though she could not yet speak of it, could not yet name it, or fully comprehend it, the knowledge was always there, a constant companion, a quiet voice that whispered from the corners of her heart and the currents of the wind. The villagers might have seen only a small girl with brown hair and soft pink cheeks, but Leora knew. She had glimpsed it in the very first shivering stars, in the warmth of the midwife's hands, in the faint crescent that would forever mark her daughter as someone set apart. Amara was born on a night when the world seemed to pause, and from that first cry, the threads of her destiny had begun to weave themselves, quietly, insistently, with a rhythm that no one could ignore for long. By the age of 7, Amara had learned that some truths were better left unspoken, that the world did not always welcome the whisperings of the unusual, the quiet stirrings of a child attuned to things others could not perceive. She had come to understand, instinctively, that there were layers to reality, one the villagers lived in, with its simple rules of bread and fire, of chores and children's games, and another, invisible to all but her, that hummed with energy, pulsed with hidden life, and waited patiently for recognition. She could not yet articulate it, could not yet name the subtle currents that danced around her, but she felt them in every flutter of leaf and every breath of wind. It was in the forest that she felt most at home, wandering among the ancient oaks and moss-draped pines, her small feet barely disturbing the fallen leaves that carpeted the earth. She had learned to move quietly, almost as though she were part of the forest itself. The trees seemed to acknowledge her passage, shifting ever so slightly, their leaves brushing against one another in a sound that was neither rustle nor whisper, but something in between, like a language she almost understood. Birds paused mid-flight as she passed, their wings suspended for a heartbeat, as if waiting for her to speak first. Even the shadows seemed to curve toward her, bending around her small form with deference, and the light that filtered through the canopy dappled her hair in ways that made it shimmer with an ethereal glow. One afternoon, as the sun leaned low and golden in the sky, a small bird alighted on her shoulder. It was no ordinary bird, though at first glance, it might have appeared so, a sparrow with feathers so dark they absorbed the light, yet tipped with a faint glimmer, almost like fire caught in shadow. The creature tilted its head, regarding her with a weighty intelligence that made Amara's heart skip. It lingered, silent, yet the tilt of its head, the slight twitch of its wings, seemed to carry a message. "You will see soon," it seemed to say, not with words, but with intention, with the very rhythm of its being. Amara smiled, though no one was there to see her. Her lips curved in quiet understanding, her fingers brushing against the soft down of its feathers as though acknowledging a shared secret. She had learned to trust these moments, these small encounters, the ones that hummed with significance, even when the rest of the world would dismiss them as happenstance. The bird lingered for only a moment longer, then took off in a sudden rush of wind that carried a faint, musical trill, disappearing between the trees like a shadow slipping into a dream. That night, Amara's dreams were filled with wonders that no child of 7 should have seen. She dreamed of a river that flowed uphill, carrying golden light instead of water, the liquid itself pulsing with warmth and whispering a melody that seemed to resonate with her very bones. The river wound its way through mountains that twisted impossibly into the sky, over valleys filled with flowers that shimmered with their own internal fire. She followed it with bare feet, feeling the soft warmth of the golden water against her toes, and somewhere deep within her, a voice soft, ancient, familiar whispered, calling her to pay attention, to remember. When she awoke, the cottage was silent, the first light of dawn spilling through the narrow window in soft, silver streaks. She rubbed her eyes, still tasting the remnants of dream gold on her tongue, and felt it the crescent mark on her left wrist, faint as a blush, now warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo the river of her dreams. It was as though the mark remembered what her mind had glimpsed in the night, a language she could not yet translate, but one that spoke directly to her spirit. She traced it gently, her small fingers pressing against the soft curve of the crescent, feeling the heartbeat of something vast and secret, a presence older than the village, older than the forest, older even than her mother's memory of her own childhood. Days passed, and Amara found herself wandering deeper into the forest than she had ever dared before. Each step seemed guided by a subtle tug, a magnetic pull that drew her toward places she could not name, toward corners of the world that were alive in ways the villagers could not perceive. The birds no longer simply observed her, they became companions, flitting from branch to branch in curious, careful patterns. Squirrels would pause mid-leap to watch her pass, and deer, which normally shied at the sound of human breath, regarded her with calm acknowledgement before bounding silently into the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to favor her, curling around her arms, brushing her hair against her cheeks, shifting the leaves in intricate patterns as though forming words she had yet to learn to read. One day, she stumbled upon a glade she had never seen before, a clearing bathed in light so soft it seemed liquid, spilling from the cracks between the trees like honey. At the center of the glade was a small pool of water, perfectly still, reflecting the sky above as though it were a window rather than a body of water. She knelt at the edge and peered in, and for a moment, the reflection shifted not to show her own face, but another, older, wiser, yet undeniably hers, gazing back at her with a quiet intensity that stole her breath. The water rippled as though responding to her presence, sending concentric circles outward that glimmered with golden light, echoing the river from her dream. Amara did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stared, her heart hammering, her hands pressed against the soft grass, absorbing the wonder, the fear, the impossible beauty of it all. She realized then that the forest, the birds, the river, the very wind, everything was speaking to her, guiding her, preparing her for truths she could not yet name. Returning to the village, she found herself walking more carefully, aware of the gap between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between what the villagers could see and what she now perceived. Children laughed and ran, unaware of the forest's language, while adults labored and whispered, ignorant of the currents that pulsed invisibly beneath their feet. She smiled at them, nodded politely when spoken to, but kept her true experiences secret, knowing that some things could not be shared, that some truths, too luminous and fragile, could be broken by the ordinary gaze. At night, she would return to the small window in her room, staring out at the forest that waited just beyond the village's edge. The wind would slip through the cracks, curling around her small frame, brushing her hair in patterns that felt deliberate, intelligent, comforting. And when she placed her hand over the crescent moon on her wrist, she could feel the pulse of the unseen world, a rhythm that seemed to thrum in time with her own heartbeat. It spoke not in words but in emotion, in sensation, in the deep, unyielding knowledge that she was part of something far greater than herself, something alive, something waiting for her awakening. Even her mother, Leora, began to notice subtle changes. Amara would return from the forest with mud on her knees and leaves in her hair, but with a serenity in her eyes that seemed older than her years. Leora asked gentle questions where she had wandered, what she had seen, but Amara's answers were always partial, wrapped in half-truths or quiet smiles. Leora could sense the extraordinary in her child, the stirring of something ancient and patient, but she did not press. Instead, she held Amara close at night, pressing her cheek to the girl's hair, whispering, "You are safe, you are mine, and the world will know you, in its own time." Amara's connection to the forest grew stronger with each passing day. She began to understand the rhythm of the trees, the patterns of the leaves, the way shadows shifted with intention. She could feel the pulse of life in the earth beneath her feet, and when she placed her hands upon the soil, she sensed faint traces of memory, as though the land itself remembered her presence. Small animals began to approach without fear, lingering to nuzzle her hands, to chirp or trill as though engaging in conversation. Even the smallest details, the flicker of sunlight through the canopy, the pattern of moss on a rock, the whisper of wind through pine needles, felt charged with significance, and she absorbed each one with a hunger she could not yet name. On one particularly quiet afternoon, as the sun hung low and golden in the sky, she paused by a brook and saw the reflection of the sky in its rippling water. It shimmered, and for a brief moment, she could see not just the world above, but glimpses of herself, in other times, in other forms, living other lives she did not yet understand. The vision passed quickly, leaving only a lingering warmth in her chest, the same warmth that pulsed in her crescent mark. She pressed her fingers against it and whispered a vow, though she did not know to whom it was addressed. I will listen, I will see, I will remember. Maybos. Amara's 7th year unfolded in this quiet dance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, each day a thread in a tapestry too intricate for words. She learned to walk softly, to listen carefully, to trust the small signs, the rustle of leaves, the glance of a bird, the warmth of her own mark, as though they were guiding her along a path that had been set before her, long before she was born. And though no one in the village could see it, though no one could understand, she knew, deep within her bones, that she was already part of something vast, something patient, something alive, and that soon, the world would call upon her to see it fully. Turning 12 should have been ordinary. A small cake, a candle to blow out, perhaps a wish whispered softly into the air, simple joys measured in sugar and laughter. But for Amara, that day did not come in ordinary terms. The morning dawned like any other, soft sunlight spilling across the village rooftops, painting the cobblestones gold, yet there was an undercurrent, a subtle vibration in the air that made her skin tingle. Even the birds seemed to hesitate in their songs, chirps drawn out and deliberate, as if waiting. Amara could feel it in the very marrow of her bones. Something was about to shift, quietly, irreversibly. She sat at the edge of her bed, legs dangling above the wooden floor, tracing the familiar crescent mark on her wrist with her small fingers. It had always been there, faint and dreamlike, a gentle pulse she had felt since infancy, but now it throbbed with a warmth that made her gasp softly. The pulse was different, stronger, insistent, almost calling her to pay attention. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the walls, curling into her room like a living thing, and the leaves tapped against the window pane, as if in agreement. Amara leaned forward, pressing her hand more firmly against the crescent, and felt a breath, her second birth, though she did not yet know it, stir somewhere deep, deep inside, in the places of her spirit she had never reached before. Her mother, Leora, watched from the doorway, her eyes wide and concerned, noting the small tremor that ran through Amara's body. "Amara?" she asked, voice hesitant, almost afraid to break the silence that seemed pregnant with unseen forces. The child's head lifted slowly, eyes still fixed on her wrist, then on the shifting sunlight that seemed to bend strangely in the room. "You're different," Leora whispered, her hands shaking as she reached toward her daughter's face. Her fingers hovered just above Amara's skin, unsure whether to touch or to retreat, as if afraid that the slightest contact might shatter something fragile yet immense. Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her mother's words, soft as they were, carried the truth. She could feel the forest, the animals, the rivers, even the wind itself, all of it pulsing in recognition of her awakening. She had been waiting for this moment for her entire life, and now she was awake to it. The change began subtly at first. Her eyes, once a soft, unremarkable brown, flickered with amber light when she looked into the mirror, reflecting back not only her own features but something ancient and alive within her. Her reflection seemed to breathe, not with her chest, but with the pulse of the world she had sensed for years. Even the walls of the small room appeared to ripple faintly, as though acknowledging the arrival of this new self. Amara rose from the bed, stepping lightly, almost floating, though her feet still pressed against the wooden floor. Each step she took left no sound, yet the air around her seemed to hum, charged with the same quiet electricity she had felt as a child when listening to the wind or watching the river shimmer unnaturally in sunlight. She went to the window and leaned against the frame, gazing out at the forest that had always been her sanctuary. Now it no longer seemed distant or separate from her. It called to her, alive and patient, waiting for the one it had recognized long before anyone else had. The first moment of true awareness, however, came when she stepped outside. The garden behind the cottage, familiar and well-tended, seemed to stretch and bend in ways it never had. Leaves fluttered against her cheek, not from the wind, but as if greeting her. The roses leaned slightly toward her, petals brushing her arms in soft, deliberate patterns, and even the bees hovered in her presence, their tiny wings buzzing in harmony with an internal rhythm only she could feel. It was not magic as stories told it, explosive or loud, but something quieter, subtler, like a conversation carried in the smallest vibrations of life. Her mother followed hesitantly, her shadow stretching long across the grass. Leora's heart pounded. She could see the energy radiating from her daughter in ways that defied explanation. Her own mothering instincts warred with awe and fear. She had known her child was special, had felt it in the faint crescent that had pulsed against her palm for years. But this was more than a gift. It was a transformation. A doorway into something vast and uncharted. Amara closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the pulse that hummed beneath her skin, beneath her feet, beneath the very earth itself. She felt the rhythm of the forest, the heartbeat of the animals, the subtle vibration of the river as it wound its way through the trees. It all converged in her chest, a gentle, insistent swell of life that had always existed, always whispered to her, and now required recognition. She breathed, and in that single quiet breath, the second birth settled fully inside her, expanding through every nerve, every cell, every thought she had ever known. The moment of awakening was not violent. There was no flash of fire, no storm of wind, no loud proclamation of her transformation. It was as if the world had waited patiently for her, holding its breath until she was ready. And when she was, it exhaled with her, allowing the quiet power to spread, permeating her being. The forest had been waiting, yes, but so had the rivers, the animals, the skies above, and even the distant mountains beyond the village. All of it seemed to bend subtly toward her presence, acknowledging her as something more than a girl, something that had always been part of the hidden currents of life, now fully awake to its own existence. Her first steps into this new awareness were tentative. She reached toward a nearby tree, running her fingers along the rough bark. The texture seemed to ripple beneath her touch, as if the tree recognized her fingers, recognized the pulse within her. She drew her hand back and gasped, not in fear but in astonishment. The forest had always been alive, yes, but now it was speaking to her directly. A bird perched on a branch tilted its head at her, its feathers shimmering in sunlight, and Amara felt the tiny beat of its heart, synchronized in some ineffable way with her own. "You are ready," a whisper seemed to float on the wind, though the voice was not human. It carried neither gender nor age, only certainty. Amara nodded, not understanding fully, but trusting instinctively. She had been born once into the ordinary world, and now she had been born again, not with cries or grand proclamations, but with this quiet awakening, a second birth that threaded itself through her being. The villagers, of course, remained unaware of the subtle changes. To them, she was the same Amara they had always known, though some noticed her gaze seemed deeper, more intent. A few children had begun to avoid her, perhaps sensing that she was no longer entirely of their world, though they could not say why. And the elders whispered, though none dared speak too loudly, that something had shifted in her presence, that the wind seemed to linger longer when she passed, that the animals watched differently. Leora, however, understood. She always understood. She had felt it in the faint warmth of the crescent on Amara's wrist, in the quiet moments when her daughter paused and listened to the invisible, in the light that flickered in her eyes when no one else was looking. Amara began to test the boundaries of this newfound awareness. She walked into the forest and focused, as she had learned through years of quiet observation, listening to the rhythm of life that flowed around her. She could sense the flight patterns of birds before they took off, the nervous shift of a deer hidden in the brush, the subtle hum of the river as it wound through the trees. Each pulse, each vibration, each tiny movement resonated in her own body, connecting her to the world in ways that left her breathless. She realized, with a thrill she had never known, that she was not merely a part of this world, but an active participant in its hidden harmonies. Hours passed, though she felt neither hunger nor fatigue, absorbed in the communion of life that had always surrounded her but had only now become tangible. When she finally returned to the cottage, Leora was waiting, seated by the doorway, hands folded, eyes wide with a mixture of worry and wonder. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked softly, voice trembling. Amara nodded, finally speaking, her words carrying a quiet certainty that startled even herself. "I can feel it," she said. "Everything. It's alive, and it knows me." Leora reached for her, wrapping her arms around the girl who had just been reborn in quiet breath, holding her close. She felt the pulse of life radiating from Amara, and in that embrace, mother and child shared a moment that needed no explanation, no words. The world outside might not understand, but here, in this moment, everything was clear. The day ended with no fireworks, no grand celebration, only the quiet, steady heartbeat of a girl awakening to her true self. That single breath, that gentle pulse, had changed everything. Amara was no longer simply a child of the village. She was a child of the forest, of the wind, of the rivers, of the hidden currents of life that had always waited for her. She had been born twice, the first into the ordinary world, the second into the extraordinary, and now she was awake. And in that awakening, she knew, without question, that her life had changed forever. The forest called to Amara with a language she had never known before, a deep, resonant pull that tugged at her very core. It was not merely the gentle rustle of leaves or the soft murmur of the river. It was something older, something patient and vast, waiting for her attention, for her recognition. She felt it in the shift of air around her, in the vibration beneath her feet, in the soft hum that threaded through the branches of ancient trees. The trees themselves seemed to acknowledge her presence, bending subtly as if bowing in greeting, their leaves brushing against her hair with a familiarity that sent shivers down her spine. Every branch, every root, every living pulse of the forest seemed to lean toward her, acknowledging something she herself had only begun to understand. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and beautiful, all at once. Amara's heart pounded in a rhythm that matched the forest, yet she could feel a new pulse alongside it, one that belonged to her alone but was inseparable from the rhythm of life around her. She had been born once into the ordinary world, and now, with her second birth, she existed simultaneously within two planes, one that the villagers could see and touch, and another, hidden, vibrant, and alive in ways that demanded attention, respect, and humility. This awakening was not just a change of self, it was a doorway, an invitation into something ancient and eternal. The first time she truly realized the extent of her power, she had knelt by the riverbank, the water smooth and reflective under the afternoon sun. She reached out, letting her fingers hover just above the surface. At first, nothing happened, and she withdrew instinctively, but the river was patient. Slowly, imperceptibly, a ripple began to form, moving outward in concentric circles. Golden light, warm and soft, began to thread through the water, illuminating the stones beneath the surface. Amara gasped, her heart racing, the familiar crescent on her wrist warming as though approving of the act. The river, she realized, was responding not to force but to intention, to recognition, to the quiet acknowledgement that she understood its language. From that moment, the world unfolded differently. Birds would sing in melodies that carried meaning, their trills and calls forming patterns she could decipher. Squirrels paused to watch her, their tiny movements deliberate, communicating in gestures she instinctively understood. Even the wind became a companion, a messenger, a carrier of stories from distant hills and unseen glades. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the slow heartbeat of soil and stone, the rhythm of life itself extending far beyond the trees, reaching the distant mountains and flowing into the rivers, into the seas, into the very air she breathed. Yet with this extraordinary awakening came an unexpected weight. The power that thrilled her also pressed upon her, a heaviness she had not anticipated. Every creature she spoke to, every leaf she touched, every ripple in the water seemed to carry a significance she could not fully shoulder. A bird that sang in her presence was not simply a bird, it was a messenger of the forest, a keeper of secrets, and she felt the responsibility of listening, understanding, and responding. A deer that lingered near her path was not merely curious, but entrusted to her care, its safety and trust now intertwined with her own choices. The very wind carried whispers of distant troubles, of lives and events she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. Amara walked deeper into the forest, her senses alive with the chatter of life. She could feel the history embedded in the oldest oaks, the memory of storms long past, the slow spread of roots, and the battles fought between species for sun and soil. Sometimes, she glimpsed visions in the bark or the moss, a flash of memory, a faint echo of the lives that had passed under the canopy centuries before. The forest was a repository of knowledge, of life lived and lost, and she realized that she had been granted access to it. This knowledge was beautiful, intoxicating, but also overwhelming. To witness history and life, to feel it in every fiber of her being, required courage. The forest seemed to recognize her trepidation. A sudden gust of wind swirled around her, rustling the leaves in a pattern that made her heart lurch. She could hear the whispered encouragement of the trees, their voices low and reassuring. A small fox emerged from the shadows, its amber eyes locking with hers. It did not flee, did not cower, it watched her with a knowing calm. Amara felt a jolt of understanding. Every creature, every living being here, recognized her as part of the rhythm of life, part of a chain that had existed long before her birth. And yet, this recognition was not a gift without consequence. The forest demanded attentiveness, mindfulness, and humility. Her second birth had given her sight, but with it came accountability. The wind shifted again, carrying scents of distant rains, of flowers she had never seen, of soil rich and deep. It told her of storms coming, of rivers swelling, and wildlife seeking shelter. Amara closed her eyes, letting the information wash over her. She realized that her heartbeat was not separate from the forest's heartbeat. It was entwined. Her choices, her movements, even her thoughts, affected the balance of this living, breathing world. The exhilaration she had felt earlier mingled now with awe and fear. She was powerful, yes, but she was also responsible. In moments of quiet reflection, she sometimes wandered to a particular glade, a place where sunlight spilled in golden streams between the trees and knelt on the soft moss. Here, she could focus, could listen, could feel the subtle threads of energy flowing from every root, every stone, every living thing. The memory of her dreams, the river flowing uphill with golden light, the whispered messages from the birds, and the wind returned with intensity. Each recollection now a key she could use to interpret the living language of the forest. She could sense the balance, the tension, the hidden currents that tied the smallest insect to the tallest tree to the distant river valley. And she understood, for the first time, that she was a participant in these currents, not a bystander. Her second birth had expanded her perception beyond the ordinary, yet it also illuminated her limitations. She could not save every creature, nor predict every outcome. The forest, for all its patient guidance, contained elements beyond her control. A broken branch, a sudden storm, a predator stalking its prey, all of it reminded her that life was neither static nor simple. Power without wisdom could be destructive, she realized. The trees whispered it in their subtle sway. The birds sang it in cautionary patterns. The rivers murmured it in eddies and whirlpools. She was learning not just to see and hear, but to weigh, to consider, to act responsibly. One evening, as dusk settled into a velvet indigo across the forest, she felt a faint tremor beneath her feet. The ground pulsed in time with a distant heartbeat, as if the earth itself was speaking. Shadows stretched and intertwined around her, and she could hear the whispered chatter of nocturnal creatures awakening, of owls gliding silently between branches, of foxes sniffing through the underbrush. Each sound, each vibration, carried meaning. Amara knelt, placing her hands against the cool soil, letting the rhythm flow into her palms, into her chest, into her mind. She felt herself expand, not just outward into the forest, but inward, into the depths of her own spirit. She was a conduit, a living bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. A child born twice, and now awake to the full scope of her existence. Even her mother sensed the change. Leora often found herself standing at the edge of the forest, watching her daughter move with a grace and awareness that defied ordinary understanding. The sight filled her with both pride and fear. She could see the power radiating from Amara in subtle ways, the tilt of her head as she listened to unseen voices, the gentle reach of her hand toward a tree, the careful attention she paid to every living being around her. Leora had always known her daughter was special, had felt it in the warmth of the crescent on her wrist, in the quiet intensity of her gaze, but this awakening was beyond anything she had imagined. Night after night, Amara returned to the forest, practicing, learning, listening. She discovered the subtle distinctions in animal movements, the variations in leaf patterns that signaled shifts in wind or impending storms, the faint traces of memory in stone and water. Each day was a lesson, each moment a revelation. The power she had gained was intoxicating, yes, but it was never careless. It demanded respect, patience, and humility. She began to understand that the second birth was not an end, but a beginning, a doorway into an uncharted world, a calling she could neither ignore nor take lightly. By the end of the first week of her awakening, she could walk through the forest and feel the presence of every creature within it, from the tiniest ant crawling through moss to the hawk circling high above. She could sense the shifts in energy, the subtle vibrations of life, the balance between predator and prey, growth and decay, life and death. The forest, vast and ancient, had become both her teacher and her companion, offering guidance in whispers, in patterns, in the faint pulse of energy she could now perceive. Amara realized, with both awe and humility, that she had been entrusted with something profound. Her second birth had opened her eyes, not just to the forest, but to the hidden currents of life itself. She had been given knowledge, connection, and power, but also responsibility. The weight pressed on her spirit, sometimes with such force that she doubted herself. Yet she also felt exhilaration, the thrill of belonging to something eternal, of being a part of the living, breathing world in ways that few ever experienced. And in the quiet, golden light of the forest, as the wind whispered through the leaves and the creatures stirred in careful harmony, Amara stood still, breathing deeply, feeling the pulse of the earth in every cell of her being. She was awake now, fully, irrevocably. The second birth had not been a loud proclamation. It had been a gentle, insistent invitation. And she had answered. The villagers noticed the change in Amara almost immediately, though few understood what they were seeing. It began subtly, with her manner of walking through the streets of the small village, the careful way she placed her feet on the cobblestones, as if listening to a rhythm only she could hear. Her eyes, once warm and ordinary brown, now held a flicker of amber light, fleeting yet unmistakable. And those who looked too closely felt an odd unease, as if the child before them was not quite entirely human. Some villagers whispered behind their hands, muttering that she was cursed, that some dark spirit had taken residence in her body, while others, those who remembered the old tales told by their grandparents, nodded with a kind of reverent awe, saying under their breath that she was blessed, chosen, a child touched by forces far beyond their comprehension. Children, who had once run freely through the streets with Amara at their heels, now hesitated. They glanced at her with a mixture of fear and curiosity, daring each other to approach, yet stopping short, their games losing the light-heartedness that had defined them. Adults, too, behaved differently. Some avoided her gaze altogether, turning their heads when she passed, while others lingered in doorways, stealing glances, whispering quietly, their faces a mixture of astonishment, fear, and respect. Amara learned quickly how to move through this delicate balance, to keep her eyes gentle and her gestures measured, hiding the full breadth of her abilities beneath the guise of ordinary childhood. She developed a careful rhythm, a series of subtle habits that allowed her to navigate the village without drawing too much attention. She would speak softly when asked questions, offering small, polite nods in place of extended conversation. She learned to avoid sudden movements, to moderate the intensity of her gaze, and to suppress the almost magnetic pull that drew the wind, the birds, and even stray animals toward her presence. Every action was deliberate, every word weighed with care, because she understood that the village was not yet ready to witness the full extent of her awakening. Yet even as she walked these careful paths, Amara could not deny the pull of the wild, the irresistible draw of the forests and hills beyond the village. Sometimes, when the sun hung low in the sky, and the adults were occupied with evening tasks, she would slip away, leaving the narrow streets behind. She would wander into the hills, letting the wind carry her words, her thoughts, and her small laughter into the trees. The forest welcomed her with open arms, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Here, she was no longer Amara, the girl of whispered rumors and cautious glances. She was Amara the awakened, a child of two worlds, stepping softly into a life that had been patiently awaiting her arrival. The first time she ventured far into the hills, she discovered a hidden grove, sheltered by the thick arms of ancient oaks. The sunlight spilled in golden shafts between the branches, and the ground was blanketed with soft moss that yielded to her steps. Birds chirped in melodic sequences that seemed deliberate, as though forming sentences she could almost comprehend. A gentle stream gurgled nearby, carrying with it the fragrance of wet earth and distant flowers. She knelt beside it, letting her fingers trail through the water, feeling the subtle pulse of life that ran beneath the surface. Here, she could breathe freely, unobserved and unjudged, and the weight of her secret power felt lighter. Amara began to experiment in this private sanctuary, cautiously at first. She whispered to the birds, feeling their responses in the flutter of their wings, the tilt of their heads. She pressed her hands to the moss, feeling the slow, steady heartbeat of the earth beneath her palms, the hidden energy that pulsed invisibly through roots and stones. Occasionally, she would lift her head and listen to the wind, and sometimes she thought she could understand it not as mere sound, but as thought, as language, as memory. The experience was exhilarating, intoxicating, and yet it carried with it a quiet gravity. Every choice she made, every gesture, every word seemed to carry consequences, and she began to sense that the forest was testing her, teaching her how to wield her awareness responsibly. While the forest offered sanctuary and freedom, the village remained a place of tension, of unspoken observation. The villagers' reactions varied, some fueled by superstition, others by fear of what they could not understand. One afternoon, as she walked past the market square, a woman whispered to her neighbor, nodding in Amara's direction. "They say she talks to the wind," she said, voice hushed. "I saw it myself, trees bending when she walked past." The neighbor's face paled. "Cursed, I tell you," she replied, crossing herself quickly. Amara felt the words brush against her awareness like a chill wind, but she did not falter. She had learned long ago that the eyes of those unprepared for truth could see only fragments, and she moved forward with quiet grace, neither seeking approval nor fearing accusation. Children, too, adapted to her new presence, with a mixture of hesitation and fascination. Some dared approach, lingering nearby as if testing her, observing the faint aura of awareness that clung to her. Others avoided her completely, whispering stories that she would hear only in fragments, tales of girls in other villages who had vanished or possessed unnatural power. Amara took note of these fears without judgment. She understood that fear was a natural response to the unknown, and that the first step in bridging the world she now inhabited with the ordinary was patience, gentleness, and care. In the village, she found allies in the most unexpected places. Old Marwan, the miller who had once told tales of enchanted rivers and spirits in the forest, approached her one morning, leaning on his cane. His eyes were clouded with age, but they held a glint of recognition. "You carry it, child," he said, voice rasping but sure. "I see it in the way the wind lingers around you. Be careful, and be wise." Amara nodded, sensing that he was one of the few who had glimpsed the threads of the world that she now navigated. The acknowledgement, small as it was, felt grounding, a reminder that she was not entirely alone in understanding the currents that flowed beyond ordinary perception. Sometimes, she would speak to her mother, though even then her words were measured. Leora had long been her confidant, the one who had held her through the tremors of awakening and watched the light flicker in her eyes. "The village may not understand," her mother said softly one evening, "but that does not mean you are wrong. There is nothing to fear in your nature, Amara. Only patience, and the courage to remain true." Amara clutched her mother's hands, feeling the warmth and grounding presence of human touch, and understood that the balance she sought required both worlds, the wild and the ordinary, the extraordinary and the familiar. In her private moments, Amara began to reflect on the duality of her life. By day, she was a child in a village that whispered and watched, navigating streets and homes with careful steps. By twilight and dawn, she was a force attuned to the rhythms of life, the guardian of patterns and pulses invisible to ordinary eyes. The hills and forests became her teachers, the wind her confidant, the animals her companions. She learned to read the subtlest shifts in the world around her. The tremor of a root beneath a deer's paw, the soft vibration of a bird's wings signaling the approach of a storm, the quiet language of leaves as they adjusted to the passing sunlight. Each observation was a lesson, each interaction a test of focus and compassion. The weight of this secret knowledge was both liberating and burdensome. With each new understanding came the realization that her choices rippled outward, touching the world in ways she could not yet fully control. She discovered that a careless word to a bird could cause confusion, that a thoughtless gesture toward a stream might disrupt the delicate balance of life it nurtured. Yet she also felt the joy of connection, the thrill of communion with the world in its hidden forms. It was a delicate equilibrium, demanding constant attention, reflection, and care. As seasons shifted, so too did her understanding of the village and its people. She observed, quietly, the small acts of kindness and cruelty, the whispered judgments, and the fleeting moments of grace. The villagers were flawed, yes, but they were also living, breathing extensions of the world she had been born to see. Her awakening did not separate her from them. It placed her in a delicate tension, a space where she could move among them with care, observe without judgment, and influence gently when needed. Even the simplest actions became imbued with significance. When she helped a child untangle a bird's nest, she felt the gratitude of the forest reflected in the flutter of leaves. When she guided a lost dog back to its owner, she sensed the joy of the earth echo in her chest. Each act, small though it seemed, reinforced her connection to the two worlds she now inhabited. At night, as she lay in her bed, the crescent mark on her wrist pulsing faintly, she would close her eyes and remember the hills, the streams, the whispers of wind through ancient branches. She felt the presence of life everywhere, alive, patient, aware, and knew that this was only the beginning. She was a child of the ordinary village and a child of the hidden currents of the earth, stepping softly between worlds, carrying a secret responsibility that was at once thrilling and humbling. Her second birth had not been a loud proclamation, nor had it been a gift without consequence. It had been a quiet awakening, a pulse, a gentle door swinging open to a larger, more complex reality. And as she moved among the villagers, hiding her full strength behind careful gestures and polite smiles. She understood that the true work of awakening was only beginning. She had been entrusted with the rhythm of life itself, with the pulse of the forest, the river, the wind, and the animals. And now, she would learn how to honor it. Amara, the girl once ordinary, had become Amara, the awakened. A child of two worlds, moving silently through the village by day and the hills and forests by night, carrying within her the knowledge, the responsibility, and the wonder of life itself. She was no longer merely a part of the world, she was a bridge between what was seen and what was unseen, a living connection between ordinary eyes and the extraordinary currents that had always flowed just beyond perception. And in the quiet, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the forest hummed in anticipation of night, Amara understood fully that the secrets of the village were no longer hers to hide entirely. They were part of her awakening, part of the delicate balance she had been born to navigate, part of the life she had been given, and part of the story she was only just beginning to write. Amara had grown accustomed to the forest's whispers, the subtle hum of life beneath the canopy, the quiet rhythms of the creatures and plants that surrounded her. She had walked its winding paths countless times, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, listening to the language of the wind and the low murmur of the river. She knew when the fox would appear at the bend in the trail, when the birds would pause mid-flight to watch her pass, and when the old oaks seemed to tilt slightly as if acknowledging her presence. But none of this, no matter how familiar, could have prepared her for the first true test of the awakening she had felt since her second birth. The morning had begun like any other. Dawn spilled gold across the treetops, painting the mossy forest floor in long streaks of light, and the air was crisp with the lingering chill of night. The birds were stirring, calling to one another in the low, melodic chatter that Amara had come to understand as greetings, warnings, and occasional idle chatter. The wind moved in gentle currents, brushing her hair against her cheeks, carrying the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. She felt the forest's pulse, steady and slow, flowing through her feet and rising in her chest, and it was comforting, familiar, almost like a lullaby she had known since her earliest memories. And then she sensed a disturbance that rippled through the undergrowth, subtle at first, like a vibration in the roots of the trees. The birds fell silent, their wings held mid-flap, and the wind stilled as if holding its breath. Her heart thumped in response, quick and sharp, echoing the rhythm that now seemed to surge from the forest itself. A shadow slithered across the clearing ahead, dark and liquid, moving without sound, bending the light around it as though it were part of the air itself. Amara froze, her senses sharpening. From the mist that curled around the trunks of the ancient oaks, a figure emerged, tall, lithe, and impossibly graceful. It was a wolf, but unlike any she had ever seen. Its fur shimmered faintly, catching the first rays of sunlight in a way that seemed almost unreal, as if the air itself passed through its coat and carried a ghost of light with it. Its eyes burned a pale violet, luminous and deep, and when they fixed on her, she felt as though the very forest had focused its attention. The energy of countless leaves, streams, and creatures converging on this one moment. "You are awake," the wolf said, its voice not carried through the throat, but through the very rustling of the dry leaves, a sound that seemed to resonate inside Amara's chest rather than her ears. It was calm, measured, and filled with a gravity that made her knees quiver. I am," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempts at steadiness. "You must learn balance," the creature continued, circling her slowly, each step silent, each movement fluid like water in a stream. "Power without control is a river that drowns the world. To possess the spark is not enough. You must temper it with patience, awareness, and understanding. Otherwise, you will destroy what you were born to protect." Amara's chest tightened as the forest seemed to press against her, drawing her in and testing her focus. The trees leaned subtly toward her, their branches brushing her shoulders, their leaves whispering warnings she could almost understand. The wind circled around her in small eddies, tugging at her hair and sleeves, as though challenging her to respond. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath, and summoned the smallest flicker of wind. It arose hesitantly, swirling in her palms like a living ribbon, delicate, yet alive. She felt the pulse of the forest adjusting to her energy, waiting for her to hold the rhythm steady. And when she did, even slightly, the wolf halted, nodding with a quiet satisfaction that resonated through the clearing. "You have the spark," it said softly, a hint of approval in its tone. "But the fire inside you will be tested again. Soon, you will face shadows that are not made of darkness alone, but of doubt, fear, and the untested edges of your own power. Remember this, child. The forest watches, the rivers remember, and the wind carries truths that you may not yet see. Do not waste what you have been given." Before she could respond, the wolf lifted its head and disappeared into the morning mist, leaving no sound behind, no trace of its passage, except for the subtle shift in the air and the quiet resonance in her chest. The birds gradually resumed their calls, the wind returned to its lazy dance through the trees, and the clearing seemed, at first glance, as ordinary as it had always been. But Amara knew better. The forest's pulse continued to thrum inside her, echoing the intensity of the encounter. She felt as though she had glimpsed a new dimension of existence, one in which the boundaries between herself and the living world were blurred, where the energy of every creature, every leaf, every stone could be read, felt, and, if wielded carefully, guided. The test had ended, but its lesson lingered, heavy yet exhilarating. Amara knelt in the moss, pressing her hands against the damp earth, and let the rhythm of the forest flow through her. She could feel the energy of the soil, the roots, the water underground, all converging in a delicate web of life that was at once fragile and strong. She sensed the tension of the trees, the anticipation of the animals, and the subtle hum of magic that threaded through the undergrowth like veins of light. Every choice she made now, every movement, every thought, would ripple outward into this intricate ecosystem, and she understood for the first time the true weight of her second birth. Hours passed as she lingered there, testing herself, experimenting with the gentle currents of air, the flow of the stream, the pulse of living wood. She learned quickly that control was not a matter of brute will, it was a matter of listening, of aligning herself with the rhythm already present in the world. A single misstep could throw the balance off, a careless thought could disturb a creature's path, a misguided impulse could ripple through the forest with consequences she could not foresee. The responsibility pressed upon her, but it was also a kind of exhilaration, a thrilling awareness that she was no longer simply a child, but a participant in something vast and living, a keeper of currents she had only begun to understand. The forest seemed to respond to her progress. Leaves rustled with approval, birds chirped in rhythmic patterns that mirrored her movements, and even the river near the edge of the clearing seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Occasionally, she glimpsed fleeting memories in the bark of ancient trees, storms that had passed centuries before, creatures that had long vanished, the subtle patterns of growth and decay that formed the hidden history of the forest. These visions were fleeting, almost dreamlike, but they impressed upon her the scale of her responsibility. The awakening she had experienced at 12 had given her more than sight. It had given her insight into the cycles of life itself. When she finally rose to leave, the sun had climbed higher, spilling light across the forest in a gentle warmth. She felt the pulse of the clearing in her chest, a steady, insistent echo of the wolf's message. Power without balance was dangerous. Her spark was real, potent, and alive, but it was only a beginning. She had passed her first test, yes, but the true challenges were yet to come. The forest had shown her the smallest taste of what lay ahead, and she knew that each test would push her further, demand more of her, force her to confront not only the world outside but the shadows within herself. As she walked back toward the village, her mind was alive with reflection. She thought of the wolf's words, of the delicate flicker of wind she had summoned, of the pulse that ran through the soil, the trees, and even her own veins. The balance she must maintain was not merely between herself and the forest. It was a balance within herself, a harmony of fear and courage, hesitation and action, humility and confidence. She understood that the path forward would be both exhilarating and dangerous, and she welcomed it with the quiet determination of one who had glimpsed the threshold of something greater and chosen to step across. When the village came into view, its narrow streets and small cottages bathed in morning light, Amara felt a momentary tension, a pull between the extraordinary world she had just experienced and the ordinary lives unfolding around her. She adjusted her posture, smoothing her sleeves, meeting the eyes of a passing villager with a gentle nod, concealing the fire that now burned quietly within her. The test had ended, yes, but her second birth had set her on a journey that would ripple far beyond these streets, beyond this village, into the unseen currents of life that waited for her attention and care. Alone in her room later, she pressed her hands against the crescent on her wrist, feeling its warmth pulse in time with her heartbeat. The memory of the wolf lingered vividly. Its pale violet eyes, the fluid grace of its movements, the weight and cadence of its voice. She had glimpsed what was possible, what power could look like when tempered with awareness and patience. The spark had been lit, and though the fire would be tested many times more, she was no longer afraid. She was awake, aware, and ready to step into the challenges that lay ahead. The forest's pulse continued to echo within her, a steady reminder that the first test had only been the beginning, a mere doorway into the larger, intricate, and demanding path she had been born to follow. Every leaf, every gust of wind, every creature now carried meaning, and Amara, the girl who had been born twice, felt the weight and thrill of her awakening, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. A week later, a stranger arrived in the village. Cloaked in deep green, with eyes like molten amber, he claimed to be a wanderer. But Amara recognized him immediately, though she had never seen him before. The trees had whispered of his coming. "You are Amara," he said softly, as if speaking a prayer. Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Arendor," he replied. "I am here to guide those born twice. You are one of them." Ifing. He taught her how to focus her awareness, to sense the threads of life that connected every living thing. With him, she discovered that her gift was not random, but a legacy one that had skipped generations, waiting for her awakening. "You will face shadows," he warned. "Darkness that will seek to corrupt the light within you." Amara listened, absorbing every word. She felt the weight of her destiny, yet the thrill of possibility surged within her. Even as her power grew, so did doubt. Nightmares haunted her dreams, visions of forests consumed by darkness, rivers running black, creatures screaming silently. She awoke drenched in sweat, trembling, questioning if she was truly ready for the responsibility thrust upon her. In the village, whispers became sharper. Some children dared to call her witch, while elders crossed themselves or avoided her entirely. Leora, her mother, tried to comfort her. "You are not alone," Leora said. "The world may not understand you yet, but I do. I always will." And in the forest, Arendor reminded her, "Fear is natural, but courage is acting despite it. Your second birth has begun, but it is your heart that must guide the rest." Amara clenched her fists. She would not hide. She would rise, even if the shadows of doubt clawed at her every step. One evening, the wind carried her to the heart of the forest, a circle of ancient stones, worn smooth by centuries of rain and sun. Here, the world seemed suspended, alive in a way even Arendor had not described. The stones whispered her name, and as she placed her hand on the largest monolith, visions struck her eyes. The lives she had been born into, the paths she could choose, the power she could wield. She saw the village, the forests, even distant lands, all connected by the pulse of life she could feel in her veins. "You were born twice for a reason," the wind seemed to say. "To protect, to heal, to awaken others." Amara fell to her knees, overwhelmed but resolute. Her destiny was no longer a mystery. She had been given this second birth to be more than a girl, She was a guardian, a bridge between the seen and unseen. The darkness came swiftly, on a night when the moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds. Shadows slithered into the village, creeping along walls and alleys. Amara knew instinctively that this was her trial. She stepped forward, feeling the forest's power coil around her like a protective cloak. The shadows hissed and lunged, but she raised her arms, letting the wind and light respond. The crescent mark on her wrist glowed, a soft pulse that radiated outward, banishing the darkness. The villagers watched, stunned. For the first time, they saw not just a strange girl, but a protector, someone connected to the very heart of life itself. When the last shadow fled, Arendor appeared beside her. "You have begun to understand," he said. "This is only the first of many challenges. But tonight, you proved that the second birth was not in vain." Days turned into weeks, and Amara trained relentlessly. She learned to listen not just with her ears, but with her spirit. She could coax rain to nourish the fields, calm a panicked animal, and sense danger before it arrived. With each step, her confidence grew. She was still a girl of 12, curious and playful, but also a force intertwined with the rhythms of the earth. And yet, she never forgot the quiet breath that had awakened her, the first spark of the second birth. It reminded her that even immense power could be gentle, even transformative. Amara sat by the river one evening, the sun melting into gold and violet. She traced the crescent on her wrist, remembering the first time she had noticed it. Her life before the second birth seemed distant, yet not gone. She was the same girl who had laughed, stumbled, and dreamed. But now, she was more. Awake, powerful, connected. She realized that rebirth was not only about gaining power, it was about seeing the world differently, feeling it, and choosing to act with compassion and courage. She smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. And so ends our tale, for now. Amara continues her journey, walking between the ordinary and the extraordinary, learning that life's second chances often come quietly, in a breath, in a moment that seems almost invisible. If this story stirred something within you, don't let it fade. Like, comment, and subscribe to join us on the next adventure. Share your thoughts. What would you do if you were born twice? And keep your eyes open, because the world is full of magic, waiting for those who are willing to see it. Her second birth wasn't loud. It was a breath. And maybe, just maybe, the next one is waiting for you.